Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call to order this October 24th meeting of the Education Committee of Council Rock School District. If we could take a minute to identify ourselves, run around the table, beginning with Mr. Salmon.
Hey, good evening, Mr. Salomon, School Board. Or Ed Salomon, I'm sorry.
Mr. Mark J. Bialik, School Board.
Joe Hidalgo, School Board.
Kristen Marcel, School Board.
Mary McKee, School Board.
Susan Elliott, Assistant Superintendent.
Andy Sanko, Director of K-12 Education.
Chuck Lambert, Director of Special Services.
And Jackie Klaus, certified speaker this evening.
Thank you. And joining us is Mr. Ed Tate, School Board. Yes, and I believe joining us is Dr. Thorwart, who will be with us shortly. Thank you, everyone, for being with us tonight. An important topic, a special topic, one of great interest in our community, I know. Just briefly want to give an overview of how our committee meeting will run tonight. As all of our committee meetings do, we'll have a presentation, following which we'll have opportunity for school board members to ask questions, make comments, and discuss. Following that, we'll open the meeting for public comment. Great, and I'm now happy to turn this over to Dr. Elliott.
Great. Thank you, Ms. McKee. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for coming this evening. I'm going to set the stage for the purpose of this meeting tonight and ground it in our strategic plan. And in particular, it's focusing on our first and probably foremost important goal of our strategic plan, which is student wellness. And our focus around student wellness is to embed the necessary and appropriate personnel, programs, and practices so that we can promote social emotional development of our students and their well-being. And linked to this is a strategy that really focuses on the study of school start times. If you've been paying attention to things in the news, you might have seen that recently the state of California passed a law to change the start times for the entire state. There are many school districts in the state of Pennsylvania, some of which you'll learn about tonight, that have already changed their school start times for their high school students, some that are in the process of doing that work right now as well. So it's something that we as a district, as part of our strategic plan, are going to study and explore. And the rationale that you'll hear more about this evening from our guest presenter really focuses on adolescent sleep and what research and science tells us about adolescent sleep and how important that information is to us understanding student success in school, stress, anxiety, their emotional well-being, their physical well-being, and their ability to focus academically as well. And the purpose of this evening's meeting is informational. There will be no board actions as part of this meeting. It is really the start of this focus in our strategic plan of studying school start times and gaining a better understanding of them, as well as beginning to educate both the board and the community on what the research says about school start times and to help us begin to do this work. I want to make clear that as a district, we are only starting this work with beginning to look at this information and understand it. We have not made any decisions at this point. We've not started looking at anything specific with the schedule, and the earliest, if we would make a change to the schedule, the earliest that we would do that would be the start of the 2021-2022 school year. So with the inception of this work now, this is 2 years away from where we would see any kind of change happening to our schedule. And there's a purpose for that, because it does take a lot of time and work to do, to really dig into this topic and think about all the pieces that we would have to think about. So I encourage you tonight to listen, to learn from our guest presenter. We'll have the opportunity for questions. Mr. Sanko and I will be taking notes and gathering those questions that you might ask tonight that down the line as part of our work may become an FAQ document that we'll post for the public in the future as we continue to move forward with this. So at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Lambert, and he is going to introduce our guest presenter for the evening. Dr. Lambert.
Thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Klaus. Dr. Klaus is a licensed clinical psychologist at Bryn Mawr Psychological Associates and an adjunct assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. Her expertise is in behavioral sleep medicine, helping individuals learn cognitive and behavioral strategies to overcome their sleep problems. She is also co-founder of Behavioral Sleep Medicine Associates, a practice developed specifically to deliver sleep education to community organizations, corporations, practices, and academic institutions. Dr. Klaus has co-edited 2 books, co-authored 8 chapters, and over 25 peer-reviewed publications. She has over 75 presentations in the area of behavioral medicine and recently completed an NIH-funded project on sleep and women's health. Over the past 2 years, she has actively served on Radnor Township School District's Sleep and School Start Time Committee. Dr. Klaus is dedicated to helping others reach their optimal sleep health. And with that, I'll turn it over.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. And really, my goal is to just share with you my experiences and my knowledge base coming from both the psychological perspective in my profession, but also I have 2 teens at home who are my live examples of what the meaning of this is all behind. And really, and even in my clinical practice, helping shed some light on the importance of sleep and sleep health and what changes can be made to help address this very important health topic. So what I'm going to do tonight is just really share with you this perspective coming from these unique perspectives about common questions, concerns, and considerations as you begin to navigate through this process and begin to understand what this is all about. So the first question that comes up is, what's all the fuss about? We've been hearing the buzz about school start times throughout the community, throughout our nation, and really trying to understand what's driving this focus. One of the first things to understand is that adolescent sleep deprivation is a national epidemic. About 73% of high school students do not meet the recommended minimum of 8 hours of sleep per night. And if you already want to start thinking about when your high schoolers need to get up to catch a bus or get a ride to school, you can already start backing up into what time they would actually have to go to bed at night in order to achieve that. So if a bus comes at 6:50 a.m. and your child needs to get up at 6 a.m. and they need that requisite 8 hours, they need to be put sleeping by 10 o'clock in the evening. So we already have to start thinking about this. And what makes that so difficult? Why not just tell our kids, just go to bed early, right? Let's just have them go to bed at 10 o'clock in the evening. Okay, well, I see there's a lot of people kind of smiling like that's not going to work. Well, there's a biological reason that is not the simple solution. At around the time of puberty, there's a delayed shift in the circadian rhythm, which makes it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for students to fall asleep prior to 11 p.m. And this has to do with melatonin and when melatonin starts to become secreted, and which enables one to feel the propensity to sleep and to be able to sleep. And while most elementary kids are able to have that melatonin secretion and fall asleep possibly by 8 or 9 or 10 p.m., it is extremely difficult for high school students and teenagers and adolescents to be able to fall asleep at that time. It's like fighting nature to fall asleep before 11 p.m. Another factor is that adolescents are then chronically sleep deprived at a time when sleep is critical for their developing brain. So if they're not falling asleep until 11 p.m. and then they are waking up, say, at 6 a.m., that's only giving them 7 hours, and that's if they're even in bed at 11 and asleep at 11, that's only giving them 7 hours of sleep per night. And when you think about that they're already in a sleep debt of an hour at least at that moment. And we're waking them up at a time when they're supposed to be getting a critical stage of sleep called REM sleep, which is critical for learning, it's critical for memory, and it also helps with mood regulation. So not only are they sleeping in a sleep-deprived way and getting insufficient sleep, but they're sleeping out of sync with their rhythm, and we're waking them up and having them do geometry and algebra and physics and all those kinds of good things at a time when their brain is still asleep. So these are the critical issues that we're referring to in the biological bases. So as a result, there are health, performance, and safety correlates that become associated with teen sleep deprivation. And I want to draw your attention to those deficits here. So there's a lot of scientific evidence on the adverse correlates of insufficient sleep in teens. And I think health, safety, and performance are the three categories that's easiest to help understand this. And I want to highlight several of these on here to begin to understand the breadth of which they're affected by this sleep deprivation. So depressed mood, anxiety, suicidal ideation, are very common among kids who are sleep deprived. You have a higher propensity of students who are struggling with this when they're in an insufficient sleep state. You also have decreased emotional regulation. And again, this is at a time when the brain is developing and they're trying to learn things like impulse control, how to regulate emotions, how to cope with life stressors. There's increased weight gain and obesity, and this is not only true for teens, but as adults as well. You've probably heard multiple reports about sleep deprivation and how it changes satiety hormones and appetite hormones, making you crave carbohydrates when you're sleep deprived, and it actually alters the hormonal regulation, making it more apt, making individuals who are sleep deprived more apt to gain weight. And that is also a risk factor for our teens. You also have increased substance use and abuse. And a lot of these are kind of reciprocal. So many times individuals who have substance use difficulties or abuse difficulties also have difficulty sleeping, but difficulties with sleeping also changes the way in which you inhibit your use and abuse of different substances. And it's important to see that those are bi-directional relationships as well. But I think one of the poignant examples with teens is if they're sleep deprived, then they go for their energy drinks. And the energy drinks then sometimes give them the rush, and maybe they can get through the first few hours of the day. But if they drink too many of the energy drinks and too much caffeine, then what happens? They have an even more difficult time falling asleep in the later hours of the evening, because it doesn't just wash out quickly. That remains in their system, creating a vicious cycle between caffeine use, energy drinks, and even more difficulty sleeping than they would necessarily have from their melatonin secretion, which we mentioned earlier. I think one of the most important variables that hits close to home is safety. I have a newly minted teen driver at home, and I know this is one that's everyone has to take a deep breath before your teens are going out on the road. But we do see with sleep deprivation, you have an increased risk of motor vehicle crashes. And I wish I had put the statistic on here, but it's like, I'm sure you've read and seen some of these things, it's like, I think something less than 6 hours of sleep is like driving while intoxicated. We would never think of having our student, we don't want to think about having our students intoxicated at all, but we don't even want to think about having our students driving while intoxicated. Well, this is very similar to that. The reaction times aren't as quick. They don't have the ability to have clear judgment and decision making when they're under the effect of sleep deprivation. And I think that's one of the critical issues we need to be considering with safety. You also have increased athletic injuries, increased risk-taking behaviors, increased physical fights, and bullying are all more common among individuals who receive less sleep and who have insufficient sleep. In terms of performance, it's no surprise that with sleep deprivation, and I think we've all experienced this as adults, but we see this in our teens, decreased concentration, decreased problem-solving ability, difficulty with memory, poor cognitive efficiency. And what I mean by that is even the ability to do homework efficiently. When you have a student who's been up since 6 a.m. and they're trying to literally burn the midnight oil at, say, 10, 11, 12, into the evening, they're not as efficient as they could be when they're under the effect of sleep deprivation. So it's harder to get their homework done when they're sleep deprived. So what might take them a half hour now takes them 45 minutes or an hour, just because they're slower to process the information. And as a result, oftentimes you'll see a decline in academic performance among individuals and students who are sleep deprived. And again, thinking about this critical time in their development cognitively and how much information they're trying to absorb in all their courses, we're robbing them of their sleep during these times when they need it the most. So it's no surprise that there's a scientific community position statement, and these are three of the most critical ones. I know there are other health organizations that have put out statements that are similar to this, but the main ones are the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, and the American Medical Association all recommend a high school start time of 8:30 a.m. or later in order to provide the proper window for individuals, for our teenagers to be able to sleep. And what starting at 8:30 a.m. or later would accomplish is to enable adolescents to achieve the requisite 8 to 10 hours of sleep per night and enable adolescent sleep to better align with their own circadian rhythm. They're sleeping better and they're getting that critical REM sleep period at the time that we're waking them up, essentially. So it accomplishes both of those tasks. So, that's great, and then here you are as a district trying to figure out, well, that all sounds good, and why wouldn't we want to do that? But there's a lot of common questions and concerns that came up. And, I'm sure we could have a list of about 100 on here, and I chose the ones that we grappled most with as a district, and the ones that come up in the science most often, and as a parent. So I tried to highlight those, and I'm sure many of you might have other questions as well that I'll try to address, but these are the most common things that have come up. So one of the most common things is that we think about is, don't our teens, and when I say they, I mean teens, don't they just need to turn off their devices and go to bed earlier? Well, let's think about that. I mean, many of you could probably answer this question now based on what I've just said, and there's no denying that the appropriate use of electronic devices is very important. Okay, that is a critical step, and we need to encourage our teens in order to do, and adults in order to do that, to get good sleep. As you know now, blue light suppresses melatonin, okay? So it shuts off we call melatonin the Dracula hormone. It kind of shuts off melatonin and wakes up the brain. So if teens are using getting bright light and receiving bright light in the evening, that can further exacerbate the situation and make it even harder to fall asleep at night. And I know many of our students are doing their assignments on computers, and it's not uncommon for them to have their phone here and their computer here and all this, and maybe the TV on in the background, and they're being bombarded with that. So this is clearly important, but even if you fix that, it's still not going to fix the problem that they are biologically driven to fall asleep typically no earlier than 11 p.m. So treating sleep problems among our teens, it needs to involve multiple approaches, including but not limited to biological, psychological, and social intervention. Without addressing the biological, and by that I am meaning how their biological rhythms operate, sleep health change is limited. So even if we have them change and turn off their devices, and even if you really are a disciplined parent and do that, you're likely still to have this issue that is driven by biology during adolescence. The second question, and this comes up every time I talk to someone, with the later school start time for high school, won't teens just stay up later? Aren't we just giving them more time to sleep in the morning, but we're not going to really increase the quantity of their sleep overall? And this was very important to look at the literature in terms of what actually happens. So with later start times, there is both increased sleep quantity, so actually bedtimes remain stable and students obtain more sleep. And there's been several studies addressing this. Maybe there was one study I was able to find where they went to bed 10 minutes later, but the majority of studies will show that they actually keep the same bedtime. So it's not that we're just giving them more time at night. They do seem to be taking advantage of that time and using it for sleep. And I know that is one of the most common resistances that you will hear among parents in doing so. And also, so that tends to be dispelled with science. And also, we're seeing improved sleep quality because the sleep is more in sync with their own circadian rhythms. So they're getting that critical REM sleep later into the morning, which is when their bodies are craving it, essentially. And with more sleep, students tend to be more efficient and productive, requiring less time to do homework. So one of the concerns is, well, aren't you going to delay, if, like, so for example, in our township, we delayed from their prior school end time was 2:30, and then it got bumped to 3:10 in the afternoon. One of the concerns is, aren't you cutting into homework time or time that they could be doing athletics or other kinds of things? Well, certainly it involves a change in the afternoon scheduling, but one of the concerns about homework is, well, where do you make up for that 40 minutes? Well, one of the possible responses is they're actually becoming more efficient. They're sleeping better, so like I had said earlier, they're able to do their homework assignments in a more efficient manner. And that is one of the things to be thinking about in terms of what happens to that time. It's not that they're going to run out of time during the evening. They tend to be using it more efficiently. So here's another question. Aren't teens just being lazy? Okay. Well, some might be, right? And at sometimes they all might be. And I think we need to consider that. But this is more than a laziness issue. It's not that they're just not wanting to get up for school in the morning, or they're not just appearing to be lazy. Adolescents, like we said earlier, need at least 8 to 10 hours of sleep each night. And I would say probably optimally 8.5 to 9. 8 is really the minimum. We've said this already, their biological clocks often preclude them from falling asleep at a time by 11 that would enable them to wake up by 6 to achieve that requisite 8.5 hours. And the early alarms wake students up during REM, a critical stage of sleep. The term I want to introduce here for you is something called social jet lag. Students may appear to be lazy in school, like, oh, they just don't feel like working in the morning. I mean, here they are at 7:20, 7:30 in the morning, trying to get their brains motivated, trying to get them awoken. There's a concept called social jet lag, and it's actually mathematically derived from the median point of sleep in the difference between when their bodies want to be asleep, which is calculated on weekends or non-school days, compared to when they're sleeping on work days or school days. And that discrepancy of when their bodies want to be sleeping versus when they're actually sleeping during the week versus the weekend gives you an idea of how jet lagged they are. And I want you to think about that. Students are actually in a permanent state of jet lag in school. It's as if their rhythms, and you know how it feels when you travel eastward in particular or westward, when you're trying to operate and do work when your body is out of sync with what your environment is telling you to do. So it may appear that you're kind of foggy and groggy and not at your best. That's kind of what's happening when students are coming in when their brains want to be asleep at 7:30 in the morning or earlier, and that they're being asked to be required to be doing work at that time. So this concept of social jet lag is a really important way of understanding what's actually happening with them. So it's not just laziness, they are actually jet lagged. So here's another point that comes up. Aren't we cuddling them? Don't we need to prepare them for the real world? Well, teaching them to value health and establish healthy sleep patterns for a lifetime is preparing them for the real world. It's important to teach our students that sleep is as critical as diet and exercise in terms of their health. For the vast majority, this is a temporary circadian shift driven by development. And I think that's really important to understand. Usually by their early 20s, once they're kind of in midway or through college, it does tend to normalize into kind of an adult schedule. Now, you do have a certain percentage of the population who might remain that night owl and have a circadian rhythm disorder, but the normal course of things that it does re-regulate as they develop and grow out of adolescence. So this is a temporary shift. And I really want to emphasize that because waking up a teen, well, here's 2 points about this. Waking up a teen at 6 a.m., and Wendy Troxel, who's a nationally renowned expert in this, says it's like waking us up at 4 a.m. And think about that. It's like in our adult normal age, now maybe some of you do get up at 4 a.m., but it doesn't feel very good to be trying to functioning and awake at that time. And that's what we're asking our teens to do. And think about it, we wouldn't be, if you had a toddler, a 2 or 3-year-old, would you even think of not having them take a nap? Okay? You know what that does. We wouldn't try to fight a parent who's trying to get your toddler to take a nap in the afternoon, but waking up our teenagers at that time is as critical. So it's also, and that's what I meant by consider other health and safety behaviors that are developmentally in or developmentally appropriate. It's important to realize that this is an important developmental stage for them. Teens also still need to be responsible. I mean, we're not telling, just because we push back start times isn't like saying like, oh, it's just trying to pamper them. We still expect them to arrive on time for school, to manage device use, to drive carefully. These are all very important things, but we really need to be careful about what we're asking them to do when we're waking them up at a time which is biologically not in sync. Okay. So another concern, won't a later start time disrupt extracurricular activities, especially athletics? And I know how important this is. And athletics are an important health activity, a health behavior for our students. We don't want to take away another essentially healthy, socially healthy, physically healthy activity. Well, here's some things to think about with that. Sleep deprivation impairs academic, social, and athletic performance. We definitely see among sleep-deprived students, they don't perform as well in sporting activities, in athletic activities, compared to when they're not sleep-deprived. Schools that have adopted later start times have found extracurricular activity participation remains largely unchanged. So you don't get a lot of students dropping out because of the change in school start times or changing programs. Maybe you have to shift the timing of such programs and how you implement end-of-day procedures in terms of leaving, and I can speak to that a little bit later. But for the most part, we're not changing extracurricular participation. We might just have to change the scheduling and change some of the ways in which we carry that out. Interestingly, students experience fewer sports injuries, including concussions, when they are well rested. Coaches are appreciating the competitive edge a good night's sleep can provide as players are more on their game. And I think the new trending directive is that it has to do more with coaching smarter rather than coaching longer. And that's just something to be thinking about in developing scheduling. Does the practice need to go for 3 hours, or can it go for 2 hours and 45 minutes, or can it go for 2.5 hours? And these are tough topics to wrestle with, because I know how important it is when you're wedded to a sport and competitive, and you want to make sure that you give your athletes an edge, but think about what the extra sleep can do in terms of benefiting on that athletic forefront. So now I know this is another topic, that obviously districts need to grapple with. Won't this be expensive? I mean, what is the bottom line in terms of cost? Especially, I know busing is a big issue, and what does it mean for our costs? So let's see what we've been able to find so far. Clearly, every district is unique. I mean, there's no way of knowing exactly how much for your district compared to another district, and what the other competing needs are and resources are that you need to grapple with. That is certainly something that needs to be balanced and decided upon. I think some questions are, if the cost is incurred, what percentage of the total budget is that, and how does that affect the priorities that you all decide as a district? Another question to ask oneself is, what is the price of health and safety that your district is able to incur? And on balance, how can you get the biggest bang for your taxpayer buck in terms of thinking about this? There are transportation routing software and consultants to help individuals find efficiencies, and I think efficiency is a key word here, because a lot of times with busing, it tends to be some inefficiencies in the system, and I know that's a problem we all try to struggle with, and how do you make it more efficient, but now might be a good time to consider how to make those bus runs more efficient, or ways in which to manage that. It's interesting to know that numerous districts have done this at minimal cost, no cost, and it might even be hard to believe, but have even saved money in doing this. So I wouldn't want people going into it thinking automatically that it's going to necessarily mean extra cost. And again, every district is different, but that's something to think about. It is known to be one of the most cost-effective ways to boost academic achievement. Interestingly, disadvantaged students are likely to benefit 2 times as much from later school start times compared to more advantaged students. And in part of the reason for this could also be, in a lot of school districts which are high performing, you could also have a ceiling effect. It's hard to know like how much more you can go higher if your students are already performing incredibly well. And not that and the other piece of this is clearly academic achievement is part of this, but also you're talking about the mood, the stress, the depression rates, anxiety rates, and the mental and social well-being of your students. So clearly academic is one goal, but also those are other important outcome variables as well. It's interesting, the RAND Corporation, I mentioned Dr. Troxel before, I know she's a major researcher on this. They actually, I think I have the report in my references, but after 2 years, they had a projected gain of $8.6 billion to the U.S. economy would outweigh student cost. And I know they used the markers of student academic achievement, and also automobile crashes were part of the way in which they calculated that, but I thought that would be helpful for you to refer to. So another concern that obviously comes up is, won't this negatively affect our working parents? One of the things I know we've learned through the process is this really is a whole community decision. You're not just dealing with the parents of the adolescents. This really does affect, elementary, potentially could affect elementary school parents, and, across the board, because if a change is made that affects other factions of elementary, middle school, it can affect everyone involved. So, and also with working parents, you need to think about childcare, okay, and things that come up, and let's address that here. So there's no easy answer to this. I can't say it will positively, every family situation is unique, every community is unique, and everyone has different needs and ways that this can work and not work for them. And this is not an easy answer, and I think this is something that's really important to get a lot of feedback from the community on. Finding childcare is always a challenge among working parents. Some parents, depending on the decisions that may or may not be made about this, some parents may be helped, other parents may be challenged. It's very individual. Balancing childcare and school start times across the trajectory needs to be carefully considered. I think that goes without saying. I think the one thing that we often forget, I know it's difficult when you're a parent of young children, but recognizing that elementary kids will one day be high schoolers, and sometimes that's hard to think about, but sometimes you kind of get caught in the moment about how it affects you right now, not realizing how that sleep deprivation might affect your family well into the middle and high school years. I believe it's a community effort to work out the glitches and determine the best resources in trying to figure out scheduling. The other thing that has come up before is so a lot of times historically this has come out of the fact that you want your teenagers home before your elementary kids because they can provide some babysitting services and be there, and it just works out better for some families at that point. I don't know how much of that is an issue for your community members, or if it would be, depending on how things work out. But the counter argument or counter concern is that leaving teens unsupervised from 2 o'clock until 6 is also a concern. So those are just some things to think about. But clearly this is something that it's important to get the whole community's input on in making this decision, so everyone kind of understands, well, how will this affect me? Because it's easy to get caught up in like, oh, I'll deal with that when they get to the high school. I don't need to worry about that right now. But really thinking about how a change in schedule or how it might affect your family, I believe is something worth considering. So I know there's other questions, and I'm happy to field other after the presentation is over. But I think the one that we all kind of are left with is it really worth it? I mean, this is when you're considering and when you sit down and you start looking at all that would be involved and all that would need to be worked out, it's easy to kind of get overwhelmed by the thought of making such a significant change. Well, the good news is that there are many positive outcomes that are emerging from the literature now in terms of delaying school start times. You do see increased sleep duration. Now, not every study looks at every one of these variables, unfortunately, but the sleep duration and the top two there, the fewer motor vehicle crashes are probably been the most well-studied. And we do see that they're getting more sleep. There's fewer motor vehicle crashes, improved attendance, less tardiness, importantly, reduced daytime sleepiness, less falling asleep in class, fewer depressive symptoms, and there's some evidence an increase in GPAs. Clearly there's no adverse impact on academics, but like I said earlier, you're going to see some variability there depending on where your district is starting from and who can benefit the most from that. And you see decreased health center visits, which in a large part can be due to, we do know that sleep deprivation affects the immune system, and it gives you greater propensity to get kind of common cold, illnesses, and that kind of thing. So it's not surprising that you would see some of those outcomes as well. So we have a host of these different kinds of outcomes that are emerging, and obviously I would advocate for continued assessment in terms of whether or not, and for how long these variables continue to show good outcomes when a school district implements such a change. I also provided a slide up here, which just seems to be changing fairly rapidly, but I think I've captured most of them. You might find the RASNAC website helpful. I got that information from the Regional Adolescent Sleep Needs Coalition. You can find where different districts are at and what they've done and how they've changed their times. But there's a whole list in Pennsylvania who have delayed their start times, just so you know that you're not alone. And there are many, many more who are also considering changing school districts. Changing school times. So where do you go from here? I mean, clearly this is something that, as a district, you will need to navigate and decide how you want to go about considering this process, and whether or not this is an undertaking that is worthwhile. I think it's important to emphasize, as much as I'm an advocate for changing school start times and getting our students adequate sleep, this is not a panacea in terms of sleep deprivation. I think we need to look at this holistically. It's probably the one thing you can do to make a difference for the most or for the majority of people, rather than individually treating students on these things. It's the one policy change that can occur to have the greatest impact on the most number of students. But I think it's also important not to ignore other variables and critical aspects of sleep health. And so I don't think it should happen in isolation, that, okay, we're going to change school start times and all their sleep is going to just magically be better overnight. No pun intended. But so it's important to take a multi-component approach to include some strategies. And I could do a whole lecture on this, but just to highlight a few of the things that I think are critically important for our teens. Unplugging your screenager. I think it's still important to set electronic curfews, or setting homework policies where you say this has to be in by 10 p.m., not midnight or whatever, just to try to encourage them to get their homework done earlier. Helping teens manage stress and addressing, I heard earlier that wellness is a priority for the district, and I think these things go hand in hand. So helping teens manage stress and addressing mental health issues needs to stay on the agenda while we're working through this. I believe that monitoring workload and homework requirements and policies is also critically important. I know that this is something that, our district is looking at and is really critical to think about, like, what are we asking of our students that may make them push even beyond their natural rhythm at 11 p.m. to go to bed. I think that's something that students report is something that would keep them up even later in the evening. Keeping a regular sleep schedule is obviously important, and napping strategically. And I want to say 2 words about that just because of educational purposes. As much as we might want them to indulge in the weekends, it's probably encourage them to keep a regular rhythm. Now, no, you're not going to get them up at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. I'm a mom of 2 teens. I know that's not going to happen. But essentially, looking at keeping them within an hour or 2 max of that window in the morning to keep them on a rhythm. It's really hard if your teen has slept in until 12 o'clock in the afternoon on Sunday for them to get a good start by Monday morning, because they're not going to have enough sleep drive to fall asleep at a decent hour on Sunday night. So keeping as regular as possible a sleep schedule is important. I say napping strategically. I'm a believer in a safety nap, a 20 to 30 minute nap. If your teen is exhausted and needs to drive somewhere, or it's a health or safety issue, you have to be careful with napping. If your child is napping all the time, it's probably a sign that they're sleep deprived. And that tells us that it's not typical for a teenager to need a nap. And of course, it could always be another kind of sleep disorder, et cetera. But most commonly, they don't need a nap. If they're needing a nap every day after school, that tells us something. So when I say napping strategically, if your teen needs to nap for a half hour to get a boost, that can be incredibly helpful and help them with their performance and safety. But take a look at that strategically. Why are they napping all the time? Is this healthy for them? I think we also need to think about avoiding overscheduling. How many activities, how many clubs, how many sports are they being involved in? We have a lot of ambitious, and for good things, have ambitious kids that are eager to get involved, and that's a great thing until it's not. And then we have to be careful of how much they're doing, and are we expecting too much, or are they expecting too much of themselves, and is that affecting their sleep? I've already spoken about limiting, if not eliminating, caffeinated beverages. Some people do think of caffeine as a gateway drug. You might not think about it as that, but like once they learn that there's a drug such as caffeine that can alter the way they think and feel, it can kind of be attractive to experience other drugs that might alter the way that they think and feel. So just being mindful about how caffeine is introduced, or how it's being used, or how they're thinking about that. Obviously, preventing and avoiding drowsy driving, being mindful. If your child has only slept 5 hours the night before, is it a good idea for them maybe they should be taking the bus the next day? Is it a good idea for them to drive to school or be driving to practices late at night? Just being mindful about that. And obviously, we're here tonight, and others have been educating students, parents, and community about the importance of sleep health. So again, clearly there is much to be said about delaying school start times, but there's a lot of other things that we need to be thinking about and educating our students about their sleep. So I'm going to leave you with a quote. Mary Carskaden at Brown University, who's been doing this research for her entire career and has worked tirelessly in terms of helping us understand circadian rhythm, and has really had major contributions to this field. I think this is very poignant. She says, given that the primary focus of education is to maximize human potential, then a new task before us is to ensure that the conditions in which learning takes place address the very biology of our learners. And on that note, I thank you. I've included in here, and I'll share these slides with you. There's references, websites, et cetera, so I'm happy to share them when you like to post those.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus. That was excellent. I'm going to open to the board any questions or comments.
Hi.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus, for your presentation. You know, we spend 1/3 of our lives sleeping, so it's very important work that you do for us and for the community. I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
You know, this is amazing, but I mean, I'll start where you left off. Where do we go from here? And I thought it was great. You had 2 points, 2 major points. One was we invest in earlier school times, and how big of a task and effect that's going to have across the board. And then we have things that we can do right now. Some of them we are doing, and some of them are, a lot of them are in the hands of the parents, you know, with the screen time, making sure the kids don't drive when they're sleeping. It's a lot of that is not part of what the school can do, but the one thing that stood out to me, which was going to be a question to everybody, was going to be how do we monitor the workloads that we're putting on these students now, especially at the higher honors levels, and you know, academic talented, or AP courses, sorry. Because what I'm seeing from my students that are in those types of courses is the workload is such that even with a later start time, they're still up. And what are we doing as a school district or to monitor that now? That's important to me to address since it's coming up. But to switch gears a little bit, I also was wondering, when you work with other school districts, do we create a baseline that's just for this school district? You know, since we're going to be taking on this, if we do, and take on this endeavor, is it worth it? And the only way we'll know if it's worth it if we have a baseline of where we are now. Is there a problem with teen accident rates or some of those other risk factors, injuries? And I think that's important for us to gauge and to have that baseline to know if we have an issue here. Nationally, absolutely, we know that it will help, but then we have to do a benefits cost analysis. So we need that baseline, and I was wondering if we do that, you know, and seeing from, like, are they, like, the students, are they sleeping? How often? How much are they getting sleep now? I mean, there's so much we need to get, just that raw data from our students for us to make a good decision about whether or not we do this, because, you know, so that's one other point. And then I could go on forever, but I'm really worried about, or not worried, but I would like to know how this affects if elementary students have to get up earlier. Does that the reverse effect? Are we robbing Peter to pay Paul? And so I will go on for many, many hours trying to figure this all out, because it's very important, and it's a big change. Because I know the last two meetings we had on school scheduling changes at the high school, you know, that was April and February, and here we are in October. This is the first that we're hearing of early start times, and they are two separate subjects. I understand they should be treated differently. They're not molded together, so I appreciate that we're taking the time to look into this, and I'm glad that there's other school districts that have taken this on in Pennsylvania. I guess that was a Pennsylvania list that's exhausted. I mean, that's the full list in Pennsylvania. So it's up and coming out of 500 school districts that you have maybe 20, right? So I just appreciate this as some of the thoughts that I had, and there's many more, but I will just leave it at that to let other people talk.
Would you like me to address some of them?
Please.
I don't know if I'll get all of them, but I'd like to speak a little to the baseline. I mean, I think every school and community kind of wants to know where their students are at, and I would advocate for, there are standard measures that you can use. We use something called the Teen Sleep Habit Survey that can be administered to your students to get a broad assessment of their sleep quality, their sleep quantity, mood. It covers a whole number of the factors, the outcome variables that we spoke of, that's given directly to the teens. I think it's important to get that and to follow them throughout the process in terms of looking at. I think that's really important, not only for you as a district to know where your community stands. I have no reason to think that your school district would be more sleep sufficient than another, you know, but it's always helpful to look to see where your starting point is. Not only for knowing your students and what they're going through, but also if from a research standpoint to see if this is a difference that makes a difference throughout the process. So I do highly advocate for that. I also think it's important to survey your community and see get their input in terms of how they feel about this and what are they most concerned about, and trying to figure out what is most meaningful in terms of what their worries are about this, whether they believe that this is a good idea. I think it's important to get the baseline from them, from teachers, to understand this as well, to kind of get a needs assessment and to try to figure those variables out. I know we did that at Radnor. We did community surveys for people to get input and try to track how they were doing with that. So I would highly encourage getting the baseline data to better understand that. I probably would defer to your district in terms of the policies, in terms of homework policies and AP. I do, AP courses, honors courses, the homework demands that are placed. The most I can say about that is clearly those, like I had said earlier, those demands that are placed, I think we need to look at those in concert. Like, what are we asking of our students? Do we need to be instituting homework policies or limits? And I know these are not always popular ideas, but limits on AP courses or how many things that they're allowed to take. I think that needs to be looked at in terms of that. I will say with the sleep, those things are going to be there. Whatever you decide, those stressors are going to be there regardless. I'd rather have my student well rested while undergoing those tasks compared to not, in terms of tackling those stressors and tackling those workload. At the same time, if there's a way we can reduce those pressures or try to figure out how to limit that, that might help feed off the other process. They might get to bed, they're not going to get to bed any sooner because of the 11 o'clock aspect, but it maybe won't exacerbate the problem so that they're staying up until 12 or 1 a.m. to complete assignments. I think that's something. And asking the students that, what are the reasons that you're staying up? Is it to complete homework? How many AP classes? Those are data-driven questions that I think might be worth asking to try to ascertain how much of a factor are those AP classes playing in terms of their sleep, trying to gain some knowledge about that. You also mentioned so I think it's a really important question. How can this potentially, there's a lot of different models. Do you flip your elementary times with your, in terms of how you actually go about doing that? So the question does come up, like, how will this affect the sleep of my other kids or the other students in the district? Earlier elementary kids actually do wake up more bright-eyed and bushy-tailed in terms of ready to learn. They also might poop out at the end of the day if their day gets extended any longer. The research has been mixed in terms of getting earlier elementary kids up earlier. Like if the elementary kids were to start at 7:30, the concerns come up. Not so much about their readiness to learn at that time, but you have other concerns, safety, being at the bus that early in the morning, family time, etc. I think that needs to be carefully weighed. We don't know, there might be I think there's one study that's not so favorable about kids performing, like elementary kids performing well in the morning, and there's other studies that say they perform better. So I can't really sit here and say, it's, it's definitely good for the elementary. I don't think we've collected that data. I think we need to be collecting more of that data to see how they function. But from a circadian perspective, they generally do better earlier in the morning. But then you have to weigh, do we want them going to school at 7:30 in the morning? So those are the things that you kind of have to be thinking about. Along those lines, I would also say that I don't know exactly when your middle school starts. When do they start their day? 8 o'clock. That's very similar to where ours was at. I don't know that we need to be, and this is tough because we struggled with this as a district. We actually had to bump our middle schools up to 7:50, 10 minutes earlier to benefit. We thought that was the cost-benefit analysis. We'd rather get the hour for the high school students and sacrifice 10 minutes at the middle school. That's concerning because in adolescence, it's starting in middle school. Or you're starting at 7th grade or 6th grade or 7th grade. So that's also a concern because I don't think we might need to include them in this whole discussion as well in terms of how much sleep they need to be getting too. So it's not just the high schoolers, it's also the middle schoolers. They don't tend to have as many demands on them as the high school students have, and it tends to peak closer to like the circadian aspect here, be a little bit later. I mean, it starts in adolescence, but you probably get the biggest push more like 16, 17, 18-year-old, like that age range. So I think the greater impact is in high school. But we also need to be thinking about that middle school age as well. So those are just some things, hopefully, that address some of your
That's
questions.
fantastic. I appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you. Anybody else from the board?
Yeah, I've got, that was an excellent presentation. Thank you. It was really well done, very clear and really well laid out well. Thank you for that. There's a couple things that the portion about the health, safety, and performance really stood out to me. So it seems logical that kids would be affected negatively if they don't have enough sleep, but looking at increased fights and bullying, difficulty or risk of higher risk of motor vehicle crashes. These are really standing out to me. So I'm wondering, I had some questions about studies, how many kids were involved in the studies. I know you have links there, but I'm wondering, as far as the studies go, how many students on average were involved in these studies, and are there any contrast studies that say this really doesn't make a difference?
Yeah, I don't have any contra studies. I know, I believe, and I apologize, I can't recall how many, I think it was the National Transportation Safety may have done some work on this as well. I do know in the resolution report, they are detailed a little bit more, but I don't even think they provide the actual numbers of those, so I apologize, I don't have those at my fingertips. But that emerges quite often, and even if the numbers were low, that tends to get repeated. And it's not only in kids, it's also in adults. But you have, I guess, it's exacerbated in kids because they're still learning to drive, which makes it even harder at that point. I don't have the actual numbers, though, in terms of that. I want to say it's more epidemiological kinds of research that they get those data from. So I'd have to get back to you on that in terms of looking at that. So the impulse control, I think it's more of these, what happens is when people are sleep deprived, they're not as inhibited. Like, so they don't, their executive functioning, their decision making, their ability to restrain themselves or kind of issue as good a judgment is decreased. So when you're sleep, this goes for adults and this is also in teens, when they're sleep deprived, they may not have that level of inhibition that they normally would have. So you may come out in terms of like little microaggressions, just snarky comments, a little bit of the bullying. And I know we looked at some of the youth survey data, and you do see these associations. Again, you know, correlation does not always mean causation, but that tends to emerge where you have the less sleep that someone's getting, the more likely that they're going to be experiencing these kinds, or aggressing against others, or bullying, or engaging in those kinds of behaviors. And theoretically, or kind of the pathophysiology behind that is because your brain, when it's sleep deprived, you don't think as clearly, and you don't inhibit as well. So that's where that's coming from.
Interesting. I've got a few more questions, I'm sorry. So I think you said that you changed your start time in Radnor by 40 minutes?
So it was an hour. Our start time changed from, I might be off by 5 minutes. I've already forgotten in terms of the original. But we started, I believe, at 7:30. Now we're at 8:30, that I know. So we had an hour of a delay, which was a significant delay. But what we did, we went from 2:30 to 3:10. And what we were able to do, so 40 minutes. So we made up 20 minutes by reducing things like, instead of having, I don't remember what originally it was, a 20-minute homeroom, it got shaved down to a 10, like we shaved 10 minutes off of homeroom, so it's a briefer period. Then we shaved off a minute in transit, rather than 5 minutes, 4 minutes to get from class to class. So there was some efficiencies found in the schedules, and I'd have to ask our admin exactly where they shaved every minute off of. But that certainly had helped so that we didn't have to extend as far in the day. Now, I don't know how tight you are already. There might not be any time to shave off, but I know that that's been something that really helped us to not extend so far into the afternoon.
Okay, but it was a full hour that you were able to start later. That's okay.
Yeah.
That's good.
Mr. Biley, can I just share one thing with you? From the RAND Corporation, they reported, I don't know the size of the study, but a 16.5% decrease in car crashes with a delay of 1 hour start time. 4% of all teen driver crash involvements are related to drowsiness. 7% of teen injury crashes are related to drowsiness, and 13% of teen fatal crashes involve drowsy teen drivers.
There's not any other reason to look at this, it's that.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what hits hardest,
Yes, sure.
I think, I mean, not that the other variables aren't important,
Right, of
your
course.
depression and your anxiety, but when you think about that.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I promise I only have 6 more.
They're good questions, Matt.
Yeah, and I just noted here quality of life for students also, right? So just general quality of life seems potentially to be better for this. I've talked many times, we have an imbalance at our high school. So my board colleagues are letting out a sigh right now, and I'm starting this conversation, but we have this imbalance in our high school, and I've often said perhaps to kind of test this, we could opt in for students to start at a later time in a smaller group perhaps of 100 kids. Has any, and that'll overcome some of the logistical issues, busing and after school activities, but do you know of any school that's done that in the past?
I don't know of that, but there was some talk of kind of a cyber kind of experience in first period or something where, I don't know exactly how, I don't know if anybody else has heard of something like this, but having some kind of a thing where they can log in the morning from home. I don't know exactly how that would play out or how that would help, but that was the only thing akin to, that doesn't sound like you're talking about it.
Well, again, we have a big difference in our one high school compared to the other high school that we're trying to correct via redistricting, which is going to take some time. And since we have that, pilot, thank you.
Oh, are you referring to like experimentally?
Yes.
We were talking about that.
So
I
we
didn't
said
know what you meant.
we said
Yes.
to the district, and I'm sure, I always say, I'm sure there would be teachers who'd be happy to start a little later and
Yeah.
stay a little later, and probably a group of students to be able to
I
run
mean,
a pilot program.
I was thinking about opposite. You guys are, if you have two high schools, you have the ideal, like, experimental and a control group already built in that you could, but I know that wouldn't fly. The opt-in is an amazing idea. There would be a bias in the research there, obviously, because then you're getting a self-selected group of people. But we're not talking about the research, but to try it out and see how it works. And I think that would be, I think there are probably some kids, the majority of kids go through this. You will still get some early birds among your students. It doesn't affect everyone equally the same. Some kids I still talk to parents, my kid always goes to bed at 10:30 and that's the way it's been, it's okay. And then you'll talk to others, I can't get my child to go to bed before 12 a.m. So I think that there's something to be said there if you wanted to do some kind of a pilot on that, and if you felt that was something that your district wanted to try, you could certainly use that as an opportunity to work out kinks and see how it went. I don't know how that would work logistically. I think that would be my only reservation. But I think any opportunity to test the waters, if there was, that could be a novel approach. But I don't know of anyone who actually did that.
So we now have a clinical endorsement of this. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Yes.
So this is a great presentation, a lot of good information. Thank you. You're clearly an advocate for later start times.
I'm an advocate for more sleep for the kids, and I think this is the way, probably one of the most impactful ways that we can accomplish that. If they were already I wouldn't delay it if they were starting at 9 o'clock. I wouldn't say, go ahead and delay till 9:30, 10. But my biggest goal is making sure that we correct the sleep insufficiency issue that we have among our teens.
Right. Yeah, I just checked. I thought I recalled one of the early big studies was in Minneapolis, St. Paul, and it was 9,000 students, I think, was their population. In your personal experience, were there any surprises that you saw associated with a later start time? Anything that you didn't expect?
In a positive or negative?
Both.
Well, my kids now talk to me in the morning when they wake up for school, and we actually have a real
Is that a negative?
Yeah, that could be. It all depends on how the conversation goes in the morning. I think that we've been really fortunate. I think in our district, we had really, I have to give a plug to our administration and our team on our committee. I think we had incredible leadership, and we really took a lot of time and vetted a lot of the concerns that the community and people had. And was everybody happy? No. I think you're always going to have people who, change is hard, and I think that it's some of these issues are more meaningful to some compared to others. Pretty much so far. Now we're in the honeymoon phases. We're only in end of October now. We've had a lot of positive, we're just collecting data now on responses from parents. We've had a lot of positive feedback. Again, who they talk to is me, so I'm probably going to pull for that a little bit. We've had a lot of positive feedback just in terms of teachers and parents saying, and kids. I think our greatest testimonials have been coming from our students. They're feeling better, they're enjoying that extra hour has meant a tremendous amount to them. They're engaging more, they feel more awake, more aware, like all the things you would expect. I think we're getting validation on that. I think sometimes it's hard at the end of the day, there's schedules, oh, my soccer practice was moved from here to there, or, you know, there's some glitches, that the traffic is a little more difficult at 8 a.m. versus 7 a.m. So that has been one of the things that we've struggled with a little bit. I think that's something to be thinking about. For me personally, I'd rather see them in traffic rested for an extra 10 minutes and get that extra hour of sleep. So like all these things, I think they just need to be carefully weighed. I don't think there was any major surprises. The one thing that I think we still are working on, there's a fitness for athletes class that we were instituting. It didn't work seamlessly, but they're still working on that in terms of, so at the last period of the day, we were trying to get all the athletes registered instead of gym, a fitness for athletes. So if they had to leave early, and it's a good creative idea, that they wouldn't be leaving their A-push class or something like that. So I think there's things that still little tweaks that we need to do to our system, but I can't say there was anything shocking. Now, maybe ask administration or teachers and you might get a very different response. I'm coming at this as a parent and, you know, more in a consultant role, but I don't think there was anything in there. But anecdotally so far, and we don't have the data in front of us, but anecdotally it's been really positive.
Thank you.
Thanks, Maria. Presentation aside, you sold me on the science behind this, but I'm an engineer and I have to think logistically. If we move high school back an hour, we shift everyone. It impacts all 12,000 of our students. And we're looking at our schedules, not going to find any places to squeeze 20 minutes out of a schedule. So if you start an hour later in the morning, you're going an hour later at night. And I don't know the size of your school district, but we can't staff all the buses we have now. So we're not going to combine any runs. So it really is going to be a staggered high school, middle school, and elementary school, you know.
Like a three-tier kind of.
We have 3 tiers, and they're staggered such that the buses can do one, then the next, then the next. What are districts doing? It is really a Peter and Paul situation.
So it's I think you'd probably be looking at things like a flip. There would be things that others have done, and I think you just said you wouldn't combine like some people have put the middle schoolers and high schools on the buses together, or the middle schooler and the elementary, or even considering all of them. People feel very differently about that. I know there's a lot of opinions about that.
I guess whether we could or not, we don't have the drivers to do that.
Right.
So.
And I think maybe the flips are what you're looking at, and then where to flip, who to flip, how to flip. Or I think the other thing is too, like an hour, we were really fortunate to get the hour. A lot of districts are doing a half hour. Will we get as robust? I think it's kind of like a dose response curve. Like I think you get as much as you can, and is it worth it to do for 10 minutes? Probably not, right? But when you reach that, can you do it for a half hour? What can you put in place for that, you know, if you change it a half hour? I don't think those kinds of discussions should be out of the question, because that might be just enough to take the edge off. I mean, you're starting at 7:20 something, 7:50. I mean, that's really, if even a half hour might make a big difference for these kids at that time. So I think it's probably worth talking to someone with a bus consultation, or even whoever you have doing your busing, to see what that would look like, and maybe looking at some of the flips just to see what can you do with the available resources that you have without hiring more. But I think that is probably that was one of our biggest obstacles, like how do we do this?
Yeah, I didn't bring up money in any of that.
No,
it is purely logistical.
I totally
We'll
understand.
talk about money later, but
Yeah,
yeah.
So I just wanted to add that when I looked at the website you mentioned for that organization, there's actually a report that the state did, and it details all of the school districts and talks about like how big their schools are, geography, students, and then at least for Radnor, it talked about it being I think an additional 120,000. So we might even be able to see, you know, just looking through what other school districts have done from a it's important.
Yeah, that actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because it really does provide each district strategy and how they were able to, you might get more creative in terms of, how you might be able to maneuver things in that way. And I also would, the Senate, I don't know, you're probably all familiar with the Senate resolution, but I don't know if you've had a time to read it, but it is an excellent resource. And I'm saying for those, I don't know if anyone in here was on that committee, but it is a phenomenal resource in terms of outlining the literature, the problems that people have encountered, very much like what you're saying with transportation, elementary school students, community, like all that. It's all outlined in there, and they provide some recommendations, not obviously specific to district, but things that you can be thinking about to say, oh, here are some ways people have managed that before, and maybe that can be of help to you as well in terms of navigating these. These are tough issues. They're tough issues.
Mrs. Marcel, anything from you?
I did have a question, but it might be for a few people. So I was thinking about, obviously we talked about extracurricular activities, childcare, there are all these factors that we really have to think about. And so from a community standpoint, are we planning to ask people to submit comments to an email address or put a specific part of our website kind of dedicated to this, the way the redistricting kind of work was done? I know I've had some people ask me questions, and I think it's going to turn into more as we, as more work is done in this area. But I think your presentation was wonderful. I think, having that resource and perhaps some others could be really helpful for people. And so that's more of a question for Dr. Elliott and others. But I guess for Dr. Klaus, is there anything that you saw through your experience maybe you could share with us as like a best practice?
Absolutely. I think there's a lot to say about that, because it's like moving a mountain too, right? Like it's a big job in terms of, but it's also one that includes, you want to be as inclusive as possible. We did have an email address, I think we might even still have it, that people would feel free to share any comments, questions at any time. So when we had a committee that met, and we would try to vet some of those concerns and questions. We also had an FAQ page where, and you're free to go on, I believe it's still all posted. Reiner had a FAQ page where we would have a lot of these kinds of questions, but a lot of the logistical questions as well, just outlining responses. And as we develop questions, we post them and we refine them. I think that's really helpful because it's unique to your district. Well, some of it is more general science-based, but some of it is unique to your district. I think that was really helpful. And I'm sure as we're talking, I'll think of more things that we did to kind of help that. But we also had several community engagement nights where some of it would be involved like with just the sleep education. But then other times it would be as we were moving along in the decision-making process, we would try to get input from individuals who, like, be it anyone. They were just open forums. I was saying earlier, sometimes you don't get as much of that feedback until something affects you directly. So until the logistical, oh, your child's bus is now going to come, your elementary school child is now going to start school at 7:30 in the morning. Before it was like, oh, okay, the high school's going to change their start time, but until it affects you, you might not react or respond. The more you can get representatives on your committee, like whatever task force that you put in place, ensuring that you get elementary teachers, parents, like really covering all the constituencies, I would highly recommend that from the get-go. So even if you don't get voices at a community engagement night, you have some representatives and people in those various sub-communities know what individuals they can go to with their questions, concerns, I think could be really helpful. So good representation. And we weren't perfect on that. We're like, oh, we should have invited that person or whatever. But the more you can include people, key players who can be point people that can help bring those ideas to the table and concerns, that I would highly recommend that there are multiple venues, either in person or like through people or through electronic means. I think that could be helpful.
So I would say what she said. I've listened to many districts that have gone through this. I mean, we're very fortunate now that there is that list. A couple years ago, the list was 2. I know in the meetings that I've been attending within the county, there's several other districts in the county that are moving and looking to move in this direction. The message that has been abundantly clear is that you need to have all stakeholders involved from the beginning in these conversations, because I think it might have been Radnor. One of the districts said they forgot to talk to the elementary folks. Yeah, and then when that came out, when it was very far into the process before that group of people realized we're impacted upon this. And in talking with Dr. Fraser, I think that, and I've already spoken to some people who have been through it that would come and meet with a smaller group of us just to outline what that process will look like. So I just want us to be real clear moving into it what the process will look like and how we will involve all of those people.
Great.
I think that I remember hearing on average it's about 18 months worth of 12 to 18 months worth of studying before you're ready. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
I mean, I think it can vary from, I know some districts have been doing this for years, like 4 or 5 years. Other districts did it in 6 months, and I think it really is very district dependent. It did take us at least 2 years of the actual meeting, and that wasn't even the momentum brought up by students and parents of like what got us to creating the task force. But I think that's like 18 months would be a reasonable. And things are different now. A lot has come out over the past 2 years that we didn't have at our fingertips, like this whole resolution report. Like, I think most people understand now more the science, more communities, parents, even students get it more. And it's more just not, I think we probably spent a year convincing everyone that it was worth it, that this is something that's worth it based on science. But that was 2 years ago. Now we're in a different place, and more schools have done this, and we have more data, and we have more data not only on the science, but we have more data from other school districts that you can draw from. So I don't know that it has to take as long as that, but I just keep echoing this idea of just making sure that people feel like their voices are heard to the best that you can. There's always things that come up. And recognizing that this isn't just an adolescent sleep change decision, it's a community district decision that really will create, have a ripple effect.
And I think to your point of similar to our redistricting where we had an email address, and I think that's part of when we really start to sit down and do some of the planning of this whole process and what our next steps are as we work with a consultant or really get some people together to start some of that initial thinking. Those kinds of questions are things that we'll discuss of, all right, what kind of an opportunity to get feedback from the community do we want to have? How often do we want to have different opportunities and to reach out to our community and, beyond just our parents, but just even businesses and folks within the community as well. I think that's something that we'll figure out what the best plan for that is and then really work to implement that and get as much feedback as we can along the way.
Mr. Salomon, we haven't heard from you.
Just a couple comments. Back when we first started talking about this, your Radnor document was readily available and is available still on the internet. One of the things that jumps out to me, and I have it in front of me, you put together a task force, as you like to say, 21 meetings, 2 surveys, 6 formal presentations, getting the community involved, getting staff, and more importantly, getting the kids involved. Very, very impressive. I have a high school senior. She could use another hour sleep. How do you feel about earlier school board meetings? With that being said, I think our community is well engaged. Council Rock is really moving forward with a lot of great things in our strategic plan and our capital plans. This is another wrinkle to that. So I think to echo Mrs. Marcel, it's very important that we look at our the committees if we choose that direction, but parent input, kids input, it's important that we're all on the same page because we're battling together. And logistically, we have questions coming into the school year with our bus service and such. But what you folks did in the 4-year timeline is quite impressive. And I said to Dr. Frazier when we talked about this, some time ago, look at the Radnor plan. It's basically done for you, so to speak. But the amount of work that you put into it, the questions, transportation of special eds, transportation of X, Y, and Z? What does 15 minutes mean? What is, all these questions that we're going to have parents asking us. Is it worth a half hour? These are the questions that you've already been down the road with. So I think it's important that, we look at what has been done collectively around the state and with our, our fellow school districts. But I mean, I applaud what you folks did. Ironically, I know the co-chair, and I need to go have a beer with him and talk about this a little more. But no, my compliments to you folks. I'm cautiously optimistic that we get this done for our kids and for our community. And I'm looking forward to hearing more.
Thank you. I mean, clearly, I think I could take very little credit. I mean, obviously I served on the committee, but really, as an administrative team, we had a phenomenal, I don't know if you know, we had Dan Bechtold, I don't know if that's who you're referring to, or Tony Rubarchak. I mean, we had in our superintendent we had great leadership in terms of helping spearhead that, and I think that really getting people on the same page. It does take a village, as they say, but really having someone to move it along. And I would also add to your point about your teen, I have to cajole mine a little bit more, but if you could get student voices, I think they're just so compelling in terms of hearing, and they won't all be favorable, but you want to that was one thing, we had students on our committee were just so helpful in informing us about their perspective, and even, just helping us sort out from a student perspective what their concerns were. And I think, and now hearing how they're feeling in response to that is really, really helpful as well, so.
Yeah, kids will tell you anything, and I think,
Just going to ask.
you just, and ask nicely sometimes, because you're not getting the car tonight unless you tell me what happened. But I think it's important collectively to have them brought into this.
They should, I would highly recommend, we had at every meeting at least one or two students who came to all those committee meetings and listened to it all get vetted out, and they were vocal, and so I can't imagine doing that without their input. So I would highly recommend that.
Thank you.
Can't forget about them.
No, they're the most important people here. Thank you.
Dr. Thorward?
As you said that, we're going to need those kids to sell this to young families, because if I'm a family with the oldest is a third grader, I'm thinking, what am I going to do when they get home at 2 o'clock or 2:15? And I like your comments, Kristen, about we need to engage them early, because the high school parents, we all have high school, we know, we know what that would do, but the younger families do not, and I don't want any blind sides as this goes forward for them, because of I see a flip in our future, it more than likely logistically, and so that's
It is. It's something that you want to get from the very beginning to try to understand how that.
How
and
that
you'll
would
be
work.
looking at things like we were looking. How do you extend the childcare? What kind of childcare services are going to be best? How do you make that easier for parents, cost effective for parents? Those are all the things that come up.
and safe for the little kids too.
Yeah, and remembering that they are going to be high schoolers.
Yeah.
So driving the cars that we're worried about. So.
Anybody else? I just want to echo my board colleagues' compliments to you. That really was a tremendous presentation. And you, my board colleagues, I thank you because you've covered pretty much all of my questions. Just a couple of things that I'm curious about. And I don't know whether we're in a position to answer this. It may be a premature question. I don't know, Dr. Klaus, if it's for you or for Dr. Lambert. It seems to me that from the schools that I saw up there that have changed start times, that Radnor is almost in isolation from its neighboring districts in having done this. How contingent is this change on surrounding districts joining us? And I'm thinking about after-school athletic activities or MBIT schedule. Are we really tied to making this change in conjunction with others?
It would be great. I think was Unionville, Chadsford maybe the closest to us, and the Central. I don't know if there was anybody else in the Central League. So I would say that it could probably have a ripple effect, and I'm curious how that ripple effect will even take place. Now I know Lower Merion was actually meeting tonight to, discuss this topic in their community and such. I would think there is something to be said if you can develop some kind of a coalition, or that can be really helpful in communicating with your neighboring districts, because especially when it comes to athletics. But I don't know enough about busing to speak to this, but you got to wonder, is there any way you could help each other with, that's beyond my, the scope of what I can offer here. But I think the more partnership you can get in that would be really helpful, particularly as it pertains to the athletic piece of it. That's probably where I would see that matter most. Because if you make the change and your games start a little later, then, you know, it kind of makes it easier or whatever for other people to start thinking about their schedule as well.
Dr. Lambert, anything to add on that?
I just know from other districts that I've listened to that it's not easy, but it's manageable. It can be done. So you are for sporting events and what have you, you do have to rely on other schools about what time they're going to start the game and what have you. But what I was hearing was in most cases they're able to work it out in one way or another. I don't, in terms of the contingents, for here in Bucks County, as I said, I know that there's many other districts that are attending things that I'm attending. How far they are in that process, I don't know. I heard Dr. Klaus speak while we invited her here from Ben Salem, so I know that they were talking about it with some seriousness. But I would say the meetings that I've attended, there's been at least half of the Bucks County districts have been showing interest.
Thank you for that. And I think we all know that Council Rock is not afraid to lead when it's in the best interests of our children and keeping everyone safe and healthy. All right. So if there is no further board comment, I'm going to open it up to public comment. If you would please approach, identify yourself, and where you're from. Yes, please.
Dr. Klaus, that was a great presentation. I'm Dr. Donald Rao. I hold both an MD and a PhD. I'm board certified in child psychiatry and in child and adolescent psychiatry, and my PhDs in biomedical engineering focused on information processing in the central nervous system.
We want him on your committee.
One point that Dr. Klaus made that does not seem to have been fully appreciated is that the sleep deprivation really does significantly increase the risk of depression and suicide. And do you want that on your conscience? This work was, I think, first demonstrated at Duke, correct me if I'm wrong, and very soon after that, the schools around Duke shifted their start times. And I believe there's some reports showing that within a year of shifting the start time, SAT scores increased by 100 points. That's a really easy way to make the schools more efficient and increase the academic ranking of the schools. Now, that was about a decade ago that Duke did this.
It was a long.
Yes. This is not new. This has been extant for at least a decade. And I kind of wish Council Rock really were leading here, because you could have done this a long time ago and had really positive results. So I think it really is time that this get done. It makes a difference. It saves lives in multiple ways, and it really does increase academic performance and children's well-being.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Kate Dioria. I am a parent in the district, and I'm a complete big fan of this. I've been following the research for years. I actually asked Mark Klein about it about 10 years ago, and nobody was doing it. So to see that list is encouraging. If you think about why we even have school, for learning and development, that list of negative side effects, the start time is bad for kids. If we found lead in the water or mold in the wall or asbestos in the school, we would fix it. It could be expensive. It could be inconvenient. It's bad for kids, and we have to fix it. The mental health, the physical health, the learning impact, safety. I just think if you really look at the science, there isn't a question. There's problems to solve, but I hope you can support this. Thanks.
Thank you.
Carl Fetzer, district resident. Today we're talking about possibly delaying school start times, but over the past decades, school districts all across the country have been packing more into the school day with great intentions. But that pushes the school times earlier and earlier over the years, and often without real regard for the wellness of our students. I know myself, I was part of one of those pushes. When I was in high school about 2 decades ago, my high school started at 8:10, and in order to accommodate an AP physics class, which I took and I was very interested in, they couldn't find any time for it except for creating an entire period before the beginning of the day at 7:20. My senior year, I was so sluggish through all the rest of my school day that taking that one class really impacted the rest of my academic performance. So I think I would be in favor of such a change. When we get down to evaluating the financial costs of this sort of a change, I hope we also consider the implicit cost of educating students who aren't absorbing the material. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comment from our public? Seeing none. Final opportunity, board. Dr. Thorward.
There's a lot of people out here, and that means you're interested. I think we're going to need volunteers for these committees, so please sign up.
Yes. Thank you for that. Seeing no other comment, this meeting's adjourned. Thank you all for being here.